So after the Core i360 from last time, we're going to take a look at one of its competitors, the Arctic Liquid Freezer 3360. Does it get the job done or not? Let's see how it performs. Let's go. So Arctic, you probably already know it well. It's a brand that has been on the cooling market for quite some time, and they are especially known for offering products with good performance at a very competitive price. Like with the Freezer 36, which we tested a few months ago on the channel, which is a very good little heatsink at a super aggressive price. Personally, I like it a lot. And on the water cooling side, the Liquid Freezer 2 had quite a significant success, with good performance and rather discreet AIOs. Even though in the first versions, Arctic encountered issues with the pump. So Arctic managed by providing a repair kit for free or by allowing the product to be sent back for repair for those who didn't feel comfortable doing the fix themselves. And since then, the problem has apparently been resolved. It was handled quite well by Arctic. So even though the Liquid Freezer 2 were quite nice in terms of performance and price, it's true that in terms of appearance, clearly the pump or the tubes were not to everyone's taste. And you can tell that for the Liquid Freezer 3, this is an aspect that has received a lot more attention, because overall, in terms of the radiator and fans, we are following the same approach as the previous generation, namely a radiator thicker than most competing AIOs. Since we are at 38 cm thickness here, and in length it's almost 40 cm. So in terms of length, it's relatively standard for an AIO in 360. In terms of thickness, however, this can make the water cooling a bit more complicated to install depending on your case. However, regarding the pump, we now find it here with a two-part design with a small cover, let's say, where the front for the VRM is located. And the fans for the VRM are part of the unique features of Arctic's AIOs from Arctic. The cover attaches with magnets to the base of the pump, which also contains the RGB lighting system. For the RGB version, the tubes are now completely black. They are still sleeved and also quite long, 45 centimeters. This can be both a strength and a weakness depending on your case and integration, because depending on where you place the radiator, it might dangle a little. Similarly, the cables for the fans are not the most aesthetically pleasing by default, and depending on where you mount the radiator, you might also need to flip the fans to hide the cables. On the side, I would say not visible. As for the pump's connectivity, there are two cables about 40 centimeters long, quite basic, no sleeving here, which is a bit of a shame. One cable for the pump and an RGB cable for the RGB version. But overall, I would say from a look perspective, having used a lot of Liquid Freezer 2 on my test platforms, I find the new style more versatile than before. It's a shame, in a way, I would say that the fins here on the pump cover are not actually a fan, because I think for most of us, when we see the first time we see water cooling, we think those fins are a fan. But actually they're not. It's a bit of a shame. It would have made it a bit more dynamic, I think, even in terms of RGB. But it's true that in terms of overall presentation, it's a bit less refined than the Core Liquid from last time. But it still, I would say, meets the standards. You just need to hide a bit the slightly less graceful parts, let's say. Otherwise, for the bundle, it's the usual stuff here. We find different bags with mounting systems for various platforms. By the way, we find here the same flaw of this generation of products from Arctic. For me, since for AMD we have AM4 and AM5 compatibility and a fairly standard mounting system with 4 standoffs on which 2 rails will be attached, where the water block will be screwed in. Water cooling that uses a system with 2 screws, which I'm not a huge fan of personally. I prefer the 4-screw system like on the Liquid Freezer 2. But well, it's standard during installation. There's nothing complicated despite everything. But well, that's a personal preference. Some might prefer a system with just 2 screws. However, just like with the Freezer 36, for Intel platforms, Arctic has chosen to make the use of a contact frame mandatory. So, contact frames are good for preventing processor deformation on LGA 1700 and 1851 platforms, and they are also supposed to improve cooling and contact with the water block. However, the problem is that it involves dismantling Intel's original mounting system, which is not necessarily the simplest task for a novice, since you can damage the motherboard if you apply too much force, and it can also void the warranty. So, the same criticism as last time with the Freezer 36, that it should be provided as an option, and you can choose whether to use it or not. With, as a bonus, a more traditional mounting system with a small plastic backplate. This would also expand compatibility with older Intel sockets and make the installation more secure and simple, even if it means losing a few degrees. I think it would be a better compromise than just imposing the compact frame. Since even if it's not impossible or super complicated to install, the online manual is really well done at this level, by the way, just the fact that it's an additional risk for the user will probably deter quite a few potential buyers, no pun intended. So in terms of overall presentation, ease of installation and all that outside of Intel platforms, well, at MD1, it's rather simple to install. The quality of the whole set, well, it's a little less premium than the liquid cooler. From last time, I would say, in terms of product presentation, the cables and all that. But well, we're not in the same price range either. Since the Liquid Freezer 3 360 is around 90 to 100 euros for the RGB version and 77 for the non-RGB version, which will offer the same performance. So let's see how it performs. Well, as is often the case with Arctic, with their air coolers and AIOs, they're not exactly turbines. Since we see here for the Liquid Freezer 3, it tops out at 1900 RPM, just like the Freezer 36. So we're a notch below the competition in terms of fan speed. Since I think the compromise aimed for by Arctic is to make a thicker radiator, which in turn will dissipate a bit more heat, this allows for slightly reducing the fan speed and consequently the noise generated. This is also noticeable, as the Liquid Freezer 3 is one of the quietest cooling systems in the lineup, even at full speed, and the difference in noise between 100% and 25% is less significant than on the Freezer Vision, for example. But we see that in terms of noise generated, the liquid cooler from last time was in the same range. But well, yes, at 100% it is clearly audible, but it's not an absolutely overwhelming noise either. It remains relatively discreet compared to the Freezer Vision, for example. But then, if we look at how it performs with the 14700K, we see that it's complicated, as at 250 Wi, it barely manages. But on the peaks, it will throttle slightly, whereas the Core Liquid or the Freezer Vision performed a little better. And if we're already at the limit at 100%, then obviously below that it will throttle. So, I would say that you can manage with the Liquid Freezer 3 with the most power-hungry 13th and 14th generation processors. But I would say that it's not the most efficient cooler for handling this type of processor. However, for predominantly gaming use, most of the time it won't be an issue. At $200, however, well, there are no particular concerns. It performs quite well, and it's significantly more efficient than air coolers, but still a bit below the other two. However, at 25%, it remains quite challenging, since the air coolers run very slowly for the Liquid Freezer 3 compared to the other two AIO. And naturally, as a result, at 150W, no problem here for the Freezer 3. It handles it smoothly, even at 25% speed, but we can see that even the air coolers do the job here as well. And naturally, for even less power-hungry processors, it would work without any issues. Next, we move on to the Ultra 7 265Ks. So, I remind you that the two thermal sinking systems at rest are not present here, because I'd given them away after my tests. So we find ourselves with the liquid cooler and the Freezer 36, and we see that, well, yes, just like with the 14700 case, it's still a bit complicated here for the liquid cooler. 3, because when the 265 case is running at full speed, you'll need to crank up the fans. Clearly, it's not very comfortable, but it can work if you're not doing hyper-intensive tasks on all cores all the time with its processor. Next, we move on to AMD with the 9800X3D. So we have more room, but it's still not such an easy processor to cool, because when it's running at full speed, the temperatures do rise quite quickly, but nothing dramatic here. It handles better than with the Freezer 36, which was still a bit tight. Here, the Liquid Freezer 3 will handle it without any problem. And the 7800X3D, well, no issue there, obviously. It was already quite manageable for the Freezer 36. A processor really easy to cool. So, the Liquid Freezer 3 here is even rather overkill. And for the 9600X, well, no problem there either. It easily works with all three cooling systems. Here, it's not the most power-hungry processor, nor the one that heats up the most in the world. But we see overall that where the Core Liquid was still well above for Intel processors, we see that the Liquid Freezer 3 is still much closer to it on the AMD platform. So from one type of processor to another, the performances are not necessarily the same. So in short, the Liquid Freezer 3, well, it performs quite well overall, just like the previous Arctic generation. Here, it once again offers an I/O quiet and sufficient for a good number of processors. However, yes, for the most power-hungry Intel processors, it remains a bit complicated despite the contact frame. But as often, unless you are heavily taxing the processor with intensive multi-core tasks, it will do the job. So for around $100 for the RGB version, or less than $80 for the non-RGB version, it's not bad at all for the price. And in addition to that, in terms of warranty, we have 6 years here, whereas, for example, the Core Liquid from last time had 3. And for an AIO, it's definitely a big plus to have a warranty that's twice as long, considering that water cooling is inherently less reliable, for example, than an air cooler. So obviously we're still not at prices as aggressive as Thermalright's products, but Arctic has proven itself more, I would say, in terms of long-term support and warranty. And all of this because, for example, I myself have dealt with Arctic's warranty for a water cooling system and it went very well. So it's a plus. And it's true that aside from that, there's not much else to say. So that's all for today. As usual, if you enjoyed the video and want to support the channel, the paid stuff on YouTube, it's silly, but it helps. And if you're looking for configuration ideas, the current graphics cards, you'll find that on the channel's Amazon page, linked in the video description. And as always, a big thank you to the great support from Ko-fi and YouTube channel contributors for their support. It always gives a boost to morale, and also financially. So we'll see each other very soon for the next video. Sending you kisses. See you next time. Bye.